You're listening to the Recovered Life Show, the show that helps people in recovery live their best recovered lives. And here is your host, Damon Frank.
Welcome back to the Recovered Life Show. We're talking about communication, how you can communicate better in your recovery. I'm on with guest and therapist, Aimee Chaille. How you doing, Aimee?
I'm good, Damon. How are you?
I am doing great. So glad to have you on the Recovered Life Show. And an interesting topic, communication. I know no one has communication issues ever. You never see this. But we thought we would do one because it seems to be a common problem. People have problems communicating, Aimee.
Yep. Even if you're a master communicator, sometimes you hit some bumps. So I don't think that there is a Shangri-La, so to speak, for being a master communicator. I think, it takes practice.
Well, we're glad to have you on the show because we wanted to kind of address this issue. We wanted to kind of dive into, what is good communication? What's bad communication? How do you know if you're doing it well? How do you improve your communication skills? Because I think, one of the big blessings of being in recovery is you kind of have a 2.0 life. You kind of get a reset a little bit and do things differently. But a lot of people, Aimee, I have to just tell you, are trapped because they kind of know what they want to say, but for some reason, when they start to communicate it, it just doesn't come out like that. Is this a common problem? Do many people have communication issues?
Yeah, like going back to what I said kind of in our opener, I think everybody struggles at times with communication. And so I have some really great ideas and tips for things that we might get into as we look at some of the background, questions that you had asked initially. And hopefully these will help people who are, mention that they're struggling or feel trapped, or lost.
Absolutely. I'd love to start off with, why is good communication important? Because I think a lot of the times we focus on things and they might or might not be relevant to our life, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that I maybe have gone down the rabbit hole with, right? And really only a small fraction of them have really have a major impact in my life. I think good communication has been one of those, right? Working on my communication skills. Why is it important to have good communication skills?
Well, this is a broad question, Damon, and one that I think if you asked 10 different humans, everybody would give you a different answer, right? And I think they're all probably equally valid. When I think about being a good communicator and why it's important, I might shift that question a little bit and say that in expressing ourselves intentionally, like being intentional about how we communicate, I think we increase the probability that we get more of what we want. That
I love
things
that.
tend to feel like they're going a little bit more our way. And I think that another real huge benefit of that is that the people in our life understand us if we're working on practicing communicating intentionally. And so
what does it mean when you say intentionally? Let's really focus in on that. Like, what does intentionally mean?
So intention would be, I think about presence when I think about intention. Like right now, I have all of these notes that I want to make sure that I land for the audience in terms of what good communication is made up of. But I also really want to be here with you right now. And I want to kind of really internalize the questions that you're asking and make sure that my answers or our dialogue is meaningful, right? And that it can live on the internet for a really long time after today, And so I think kind of calming down and being in the moment of what you and I are doing here right now is really helpful in me being intentional about how I communicate.
I love that. You said something kind of interesting that I think is what a lot of people experience, especially in early recovery. When people first start to get sober, Aimee, I think one of the issues is that they realize that they're not in the present a lot. They're in the past, they're in the future, they're not really spending a lot of time. And this was a big aha moment for me, is like, I'm not spending a lot of time in the actual present moment. So I love when you talk about intentionality, because it brings us into, what are we doing in the here and now? And one of the things that I have learned in recovery is that all the great stuff come in the here and now, right? When I'm future tripping, or when I have resentments, or I'm in the past, or I'm trapped in the past, and I really can't get out of that, right? That's where all of the misery and frustration and just feeling like I'm in the mud happens. How are some of the ways to know, Aimee, if you're not a good communicator? Because I think, everybody has had relationships or friends in their life or family members to say, you just don't communicate well. Like, I don't understand what you mean.
Yeah.
What are some of those tips if people are listening to this and say, well, I really don't know if I am a good communicator?
Right. I mean, I say, the first thing is like, I think the more you practice, the better you get. That's one like encouraging line that I want people to take from our conversation today, is that just because you might feel like you're a bad communicator, maybe you're not getting what you want as much as you'd like, and so could that be a reflection of how you did or didn't communicate? Maybe you're getting feedback that you're a horrible communicator, which isn't always true, but you can use that as a piece of information, a data point, so to speak. But one of the notes that I have here is you might feel chronically frustrated in your life. Like, I am not getting what I want over and over and over again. And so I would encourage people, like, look at, is there anything that you're contributing to the cycle where you feel frustrated, where more communication or more intentional communication might help? Right. And so going back to this piece of advice, I don't do a whole lot of advice giving, but the piece of advice around encouraging people to practice is like continuing to practice and look at, like, can I communicate this in a different way? Can I soften my tone? Can I use, different words? Do I need to really sit and think about how I feel or think about this issue before I go out and try and, promote it with others? So I think that, we're kind of going back to some of these recurring themes around practice and around intentionality when it comes to how to know if I'm quote unquote bad at communicating. The other thing I'll say that I don't know gets as much attention is this idea of lack of communication. And as I was reflecting upon my own experience, I know that a lot of times, if I felt chronically frustrated or angry about something, it kind of I could trace it back to a time when I stayed quiet. And so, I think staying quiet is a form of communication, and it's a really useful tool. There are times when it is very, very relevant, and there are other times where not speaking up doesn't serve us well. Does that make sense?
I love that. Oh, absolutely, Aimee. Looking back, some of the best communication I've ever had is knowing what not to say. Matter of fact, that's always my issue, as I will always maybe over communicate it. And it's knowing what not to say a lot of the times is much more important than sometimes knowing what to say. Like being able to sometimes communicate, like, I really don't know what to say, or I really don't have thoughts on this yet, it is fine. I've learned is to just be able to communicate. You don't know.
I love that. That is one of my future tips. You scooped me. I love that one. But yeah, this idea of playing with, is now the right time? Timing is a huge part of being a good communicator, right? As well as, is now a time when I speak up versus is now a time when I kind of keep my thoughts to myself. And I'll tell a real simple anecdote of this, which is, a time when I chose to speak up that served me was I was in line at Costco. And I was in a line where they had a helper kind of bagging up my, putting my groceries in a box. And they gave me like a really crappy, wet, soggy box. And I could see, me kind of trying to get this box out to my car and load it, and it not going well for me. And so ordinarily, when I didn't speak up as much, I would have stayed quiet because I didn't want to inconvenience others. Right? I didn't want to put anybody out. But being able to say, hey, do you think I could have a different box? It was a real simple request, and it was no skin off the other person's back, and it made life easier for me.
I love that. And knowing the tone and how to actually communicate that
Mhm.
is really the whole nuance of this. I,
Mhm.
I want to dive in a little bit, Aimee, because I think one of the issues that I have found in just coaching, doing accountability coaching for people that are early in recovery and they're trying to work towards their goals, is that a lot of the times they will communicate absolutely effectively. But especially in the first couple years, I would even say the first 3 to 5 years, they haven't quite figured out that because of their alcoholism or just because of the family that they were born into or whatever, is that they're around a lot of people. They attract a lot of dysfunctional people, and especially alcoholics, like a moth to a flame. I've never met an alcoholic that's not surrounded by codependents. There's a lot of codependency, right, in alcoholism. And sometimes you can communicate really effectively, but when you're listening back, you don't like the answer that they're giving. And you mentioned that a little bit earlier. It's like, no, I'm communicating like this is a boundary for me. And they're communicating back, I don't care or whatever. And you just don't like the answer. So a lot of times I feel like I have seen, especially in early recovery, people are like, oh man, my communication skills are really, really bad. I'm communicating this and they're just, obviously I'm not doing it right. I'm like, no, you are doing it right. They're telling you, you have to listen. How important is listening to what people are actually telling you back when you're communicating with them?
I mean, I would say if I had to rate like in percentage form, if I had to assign ratios, I would say, well, I'm a therapist, so I like practice listening every day. I think listening is just as, if not more important than talking. And, you had asked me a question at the beginning about, what's the value of being a good communicator? And I can think of so many reasons why listening is valuable. I think it teaches us about ourselves, when we hear feedback from other people. I think it teaches us
Absolutely.
about the world. Like we're able to learn when we just shut up for a minute and just take in what is coming at us, right? That doesn't mean take in abuse. That doesn't mean take in people violating your boundaries, kind of to your more recent point, right? But people are giving us feedback, when they talk, when they stay silent, when they use nonverbals. I just want to put in a plug for nonverbals. I mean, if you do a Google search today on, what percentage of communication is words versus nonverbals, the range of nonverbal communication is in the upward of 70 to 90%.
Mm.
Which means that, by me staying quiet, by me doing one of these, right, where I'm shrugging my shoulders, I'm communicating. I haven't used any words to do it, but I'm sending you a message. So I think that's a really important, just a rule of thumb to keep in mind is, when we talk about tips for becoming a better communicator, knowing how you are in your body and the nonverbal communication that you use is really, really important. And a lot of people are not aware of that, right? You may not be aware of a little wrinkle in your brow as you're talking, or an upturned corner of your mouth, a sneer. And so, one of the things that I always encourage people to do is take yourself in. If you can do this sort of Zoom format where you get to see yourself on camera, if you can listen back to a message that you left for somebody, if you can record yourself and listen back to it, all of that is really helpful input for just understanding how you are as a communicator.
Yeah. You know what? I think it's, I think this is a practice like anything else. It's like tennis, communicate, being able to practice communication, I think is very, very important. And I think that that's one of the benefits, honestly, of 12-step groups is
Mhm.
being able to kind of verbalize what you're feeling. And, one of the early things that I realized and learned in going to a 12-step group is that, feelings aren't facts. And if I'm communicating what I feel, I need to say, hey, I'm communicating, I feel this, and it's totally fine to feel it, right? But sometimes I might feel one thing, but it's not really the fact, right? Like I feel frustrated a lot of times. It's like, I'm just not reaching my goals because I'm somebody who's very type A and I'm very like to be high performing and do all this other stuff. And, and I communicate these feelings to people sometimes, And I've had people turn around and say, Damon, this is just like, this is crazy. Like, it's not, you've done more today than I did in this month, right? Like, so I've learned that sometimes I have to be careful about how I communicate things. I have to kind of set it up right. It's like, hey, this is bugging me, or I'm feeling this, right? Because what happens is that you could drain people. I know say drain because they're just not, they just don't understand. They're like, what? Like my friend was like, why are you feeling like that? You didn't say you're feeling, you're saying, no, this is exactly what's going on. But that isn't the facts. That's not what's going on. It's just something that you feel about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And we call that in therapy parlance, we call that emotional reasoning, right? Where you're having a feeling and you believe that it is kind of a true part of life, not to negate your feelings. Like you just talked about your own desire for productivity, right? High output. You want to kind of always be moving forward, is what I heard you say. And feeling frustrated with yourself when you don't feel like you're moving forward, but having your outside world, your people reflect back to you that you get more done before noon than they do all day, right? So it's a really interesting comparison of your own self-talk, like how you think about yourself and what you believe about yourself, and what others are reflecting back to you about what they see. And I think both of those things can be true.
For all of you Recovered Life Show listeners who've battled in sobriety and are ready to level up, listen up. I'm offering a week of my accountability coaching absolutely free. This isn't just about day-to-day survival. It's about aggressively propelling your life forward. Whether you're new to sobriety or have been sober for years and are struggling to elevate your life, I'm going to be your partner for a week and help you get on track and start living the recovered life you deserve. We're not just talking about setting goals here. We're going to pursue real, tangible breakthroughs in your personal and business life. This is more than recovery. It's about owning your path and seizing the greatness you're destined for. But hurry, spaces are limited. Don't wait. Go to damonfrank.com and claim your free week and start your journey. It's time to transform survival into thriving. Visit damonfrank.com and book your free week now.
Both can be real.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have people in your life, whether it's a therapist like you or a sponsor or somebody, a coach, somebody that's in your life that can actually tell you the truth, right? Like, because
Yes.
I think that's the most important thing. And, and I've had people, especially in early recovery, I look back decades ago saying certain things.
Yeah.
And they were saying like, hey, you know what? Like, that's something you just don't share with these people, right? Like, and this is why you don't do it. It's because it's not helpful, right? It's not helpful. So like kind of talking about like what not to say, like we were saying before, is just so important. I want to jump real quick into digital communication, because I'm sure as a therapist, you could probably have your whole practice just on text messaging alone, right? Just people who have made really bad communication techniques or really bad communication errors, faux pas, just with digital communication. It seems that people don't have the same boundaries, Aimee, with digital communication than they do personally, because I have even caught myself to say, like, I would never say that to somebody to their face. Why would I say it digitally?
I call that keyboard courage.
Yeah.
I think it's an important aspect of our lives. It's so pervasive, right? This idea that we're all carrying, one of these little computers around in our pocket. I mean, pretty much all the time. I think digital communication is so helpful. It's so convenient. A lot of times it's free or really, really cheap to be able to use our devices to, send messages and talk to people. And I think the flip side of that is that for a lot of people, it has become kind of like a default activity, right? When you talk about texting, when you talk about these social media platforms, like on the one hand, it's such a great way to connect with people. And on the other hand, it can become an addiction of sorts. I think people sometimes feel like they've lost a limb if they don't have their phone on them, And so I think we're talking about two different things, but I want to kind of blend them together. Your point is about how to know when to use which mode of communication, right? Is this something that I would say in writing, over an email or over a text versus something that is more appropriate to say to somebody in person? And I'm kind of talking about, it makes sense that people default to using text and other mediums than in real life, because it has become such a ubiquitous part of how we connect with other people. And so I think, in my own experience of like putting things in writing, I've kind of learned the hard way. Like if you think about like a moment where you really want to kind of, let somebody have a piece of your mind, I think those types of experiences and moments are better to do face to face, because you have all of that kind of going back to what we said earlier, all of the inputs of kind of what's going on for the other person. And you can kind of work through the issue in real time versus this sort of more, I call it asynchronous, right? Where it's like you shoot an email or a text over to somebody and then you have to wait. Because I think there's a lot that's involved in the waiting that we have come to expect this idea of like, near real time or instantaneous responding. And we can oftentimes make up a lot of stories about what's happening in those gaps as we're waiting for the response to come back to the communication that we sent over. Is that sitting well with you? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. You know what? I think there's a passive element in digital communication where not only do you not have to take accountability, but I find, and I've seen this happen, is that I was somebody who was a big face-to-face person. I talked on the phone a lot, what I would call real-time communication, right? Like in real time. And then COVID comes, right? And, and I had a conversation with somebody earlier this morning about this, about how what I found is that I became more passive, more kind of, more kind of guarded and less willing to actually get on the phone with people. And the other day I said, oh, this is ridiculous. Because I had a whole career where I would call people that I didn't know, right, and talk with people. And even in the podcast, I didn't know you before we did this podcast. So it's like just being able to reach out to people and talk with people. I started to notice my communication skills have eroded and my impact with other people had eroded, right? And so one of the things I've noticed with recovery, sponsorship, accountability coaching, any of this kind of stuff, I've really shifted to video apps where I see people face to face. I'm a big Marco Polo user a lot. I love that. Just face to face. And I have found that when people won't do that now, especially in addiction recovery, when their communication shifts all to digital, it's WhatsApp, text messages, email, typically they're withdrawing inside and unwilling to be vulnerable, right? Which ultimately stops their growth in the recovery process.
Yeah. And I would say, this unwillingness to be vulnerable, it could also be fear of vulnerability.
Yeah.
I mean, vulnerability is one of the most sort of intimate places that we can hang out as humans. And so I think, really wanting to kind of shine a spotlight on this idea that being vulnerable is scary and has huge human growth potential. And so if you can find, kind of to your point about a sponsor or I call them a trusted advisor, right? Somebody in your inner circle, it could be one or two people tops. It doesn't have to be every single friend that you have in your contact list. One or two people that you can practice vulnerability with, you'll get better, and I think you really start to kind of refine this idea of when do I share my vulnerability or say something versus when do I keep that to myself and maybe kind of think about it a little bit more before I share it, kind of going back to that idea of timing.
Love that. Do you think at the end of the day, Aimee, that people maybe know how to communicate a lot better than they think they do? It's just that they're afraid of the outcome. How much of fear is I'm afraid, because, I look back about conversations that I've had that I've been super fearful of. I knew how to communicate that long before I had the conversation, but it was the fear of what I would hear back that was the issue. It wasn't a communication issue at all. It was actually an emotional maturity issue. At the time, it was just like, I kind of knew the answer. I definitely had to ask the question, but I didn't want to, I was afraid of the response.
I think that is such a huge part of what keeps us quiet and keeps us from sharing is, let's call it what you will, emotions. Fear is a good one. I think, worry or concern might be like a little bit less than fear, but kind of still in that same emotional vein of what will this person think of me? Oftentimes in intimate relationships, I have a worry about sharing my true self because I'm worried about rejection, right? Like if I show up as my, and share this part of me, this other person isn't going to like me anymore. And so I think that those kinds of worries about how we are perceived are a big part of the reason why we keep to ourselves as humans.
Love that. Aimee, I want to discuss real quick, how do you become a better communicator? What are some of the tips here? Because I'm sure people are listening to this and saying, wow, a lot of stuff that Aimee is talking about here, I definitely resonate with. But how do I improve it? Like, what's a way that right now somebody could leave this podcast and become a better communicator?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is, most of us walking around in our adult lives didn't get great modeling for how to communicate well. Okay, so just know that like we're all kind of starting at pretty much the same baseline in my experience. A lot of people will come into therapy and say, I didn't see great role models when I was growing up for how to have effective communication or a good marriage or a good relationship. And don't feel like you're in the minority there, like we're all learning. And that's why I keep saying like practice, to just try it out on people and see what kind of results you get. A lot of what I do in my work with clients is experimentation. Like I don't have the silver bullet for what is absolutely going to work necessarily. A lot of it depends on the person. A lot of it depends on the people that they're interacting with. And so you have to kind of find what works for you. But I would say one of the very early sort of step one or step A's that I have, if you want to become an effective communicator, is knowing yourself. And so the exercise that I have for that, I'm calling spot the dot. So take a magic marker or a pen, put a little dot on your hand somewhere. And any time throughout the day when you see that dot, just do a real quick check-in and try and identify how you feel and what's going on for you. Because, we liken feelings to waves, right? And if you've ever sat and watched the ocean and the wave pattern for any amount of time, you notice that the waves keep coming, right? And that's kind of how feelings are. Feelings are kind of fickle. You feel frustrated one moment and, pretty content the next. And so checking in with yourself throughout the day to notice how you feel and notice if it's connected to any condition or event can give you a lot of information about your current state. And the reason that I think feelings and sort of inner condition is so important is that oftentimes affects the way we feel. Right. So,
this really intersects well with, I think, long-term recovery. What I see a lot, Aimee, and I just look back on myself, is that the times that I'm the most at risk to relapse are the times when I have a lot of feelings, but can't really, I don't want to use the word explain because that's not right. It's almost kind of find out what's really going on. Like, oh, I'm frustrated, but what's really going on is this, right? And that is a danger point I see, in recovery, is the inner communication with yourself. Like we talk a lot about being able to, like Costco, being able to communicate like, hey, this doesn't work for me, or to be able to communicate about, we talk a lot about a lot about that. But I found that in a successful recovery, the best communication skills that I could have ultimately are with the communication skills that I have with myself. What am I telling myself about this? Because this is where all the problems arise, I find, with communicate, is what I'm actually communicating. Because, oh yes, this is real, this is not, and I have somebody in my life who has this one line that they says, well, who says that's real? Like, who said that? Can you give me some sort of right? And he breaks those down for me, because I could see, it's like, you know what? No one said that. That was just some thought I had. I started communicating with myself. Then I started communicating that to other people. I didn't get the response back that I wanted. So now I'm hurt. Details, but don't want to say that I am, right? And I find it's a cycle. And so much of that starts to erode your emotional stability that it brings you to a point that you're very prone to relapse, because you just have feelings coming at you. And I see this not so much in later sobriety. Like now I say, oh, that's what this is about. Or if I have feelings, it's just feelings. You know what I mean? But if I have the same feeling over and over again, I start to know, what's this about? Is it really about that, the trash wasn't taken out, or is it something more?
Yeah.
Right. Can we talk about that inner dialogue a little bit? Because I think that is a huge part of this, especially with people in recovery.
Yeah. I think, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how this is how our brains work. Everybody's brain is on almost all the time, right? And so we have this inner dialogue and this idea of the automatic thought process, which is like our brains are kind of coursing through, I can't remember what the number is. It's like 60,000 automatic thoughts a day, right? Some of them are neutral, some of them are super positive, and some of them are negative. And we've come to know those as negative automatic thoughts, NATs for short, kind of annoying in a way, right? Can really get in the way. And so, I was thinking about the school of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Where oftentimes you have a feeling, and that feeling was brought about by an event, and it can create negative thought patterns. Right. And that can kind of tank your whole day. Like I have an example from yesterday, where I live, it's really cold. It's unseasonably cold right now. The pattern has been to kind of thaw just enough to like get the snow all slushy and then freeze again to get it all crunchy. So you've got this like thick layer of ice on your windshield, and it's dangerous to drive. And, I'm used to like, pretty sunny skies and no precipitation. And so I'm like, I had this event, which was a snow and then a slush and then a freeze. And now I'm like upset about it for some reason. And that's actually, yesterday I had an experience where it just kind of ruined. I tried not to let it ruin my whole day, but I was in a grumpy mood. So I had these thoughts of like, I can't do what my normal routine in this weather, right? It's a situation that is completely beyond my control. And I had some negative thoughts, and that led me to feel all kinds of things, all kinds of negative feelings yesterday. So, just an opportunity to say, like, it happens all the time. It happens for conditions that we can control and can't control. And I think being able to, what I call, walk back that chain and understand, like, it even impacted my communication with my coworkers, where I was like kind of rough with them, rougher than I'd like to be. And it's like, wow, what's going on? And so walking back the chain, well, I'm in a grumpy mood, and it turns out that I hate wearing these boots, and, it's wet outside, and like all kinds of reasons why I got to that place. And so, kind of linking up with your part of the conversation about having a thought and then kind of perpetrating that on the world in a way is something that happens a lot. And I think it's useful to look at in more depth.
Final thoughts here, Aimee, for anybody who's listening to this and said, you know what, I've identified that I've been a bad communicator since third grade. It's never going to change. There's no hope for me. I'm always going to be a bad communicator. What would you say to this person who's listening? I said, I know maybe my breakthrough is going to come in being able to communicate better. Is there hope for them? Is there hope?
Absolutely. I mean, my favorite 3 words are don't give up, never give up. That would be my sort of advice. But I think, the other thing that occurs to me is that being in recovery is a special time to initiate new habits. A lot of things for people who are experiencing recovery are new. even if they're not new. You know, like I spoke to somebody the other day who is practicing sobriety and has been sober for over a year, who was saying, like, I am needing to know how to be intimate with my partner in a different way. Like, this is not something that I'm familiar with. I'm used to being high, you know, when we're having intimate moments. And so, you know, I think there is always room for improvement when it comes to communication. And, you know, you asked for tips earlier and we talked about spot the dot, but the other one that I want to kind of sneak in here, and this is something that everybody can get started with right now, is this idea of congruency, which is, if you say you're going to do something, do it. Like, match those two pieces up, right? That's what, at the end of the day, congruency means to me, is that, you know, both sides match. You know, if you say that you mean something, mean what you say, you know, like it, I mean, some people call it honesty, some people call it transparency, and I call it congruency. And the thing that congruency leads to is trust. And I think that is one of the most important things for a relationship, and a way that you can directly connect the quality of your relationships to your communication.
Love that. Really great advice. Aimee, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We're going to put links, guys, to how you can get a hold of Aimee in the show notes, and we're going to put all that information in there. Definitely connect with her if you would like to work on your communication skills. Final thoughts, Aimee?
I just am loving this conversation. I could sit here and talk to you about this for 2 or 3 more hours, probably.
Well, we're going to have to do more about communication, some future episodes. Thanks so much for coming on the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Damon.
Sometimes addiction recovery can be a lonely battle, but you don't have to fight it alone. At Recovered Life, we're dedicated to helping you live your best recovered life. And that's why we're inviting you to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. Every week, we carefully curate exclusive content from leading minds in addiction recovery, mental health, and all things important to the recovery lifestyle. Stay in the know with the latest news about addiction and get exclusive invitations to special recovery-focused events, and explore insights tailored to support recovery from alcoholism, drug addiction, codependency, disordered eating, dysfunctional family dynamics, gambling, and so much more. With our newsletter, each week becomes an opportunity for growth, healing, and taking a step closer to the life you deserve. Take your first step towards a brighter future today. Go to recoveredlife.us and subscribe for free. Sign up now at recoveredlife.us.